My name is Henry James Young. I'm Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Ethics at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. What I'd like to talk about is some emerging themes in the Afro-American religious tradition and process theology, looking for points of convergence and divergence that may illumine some dimensions that are significant to both. The first theme that I like to mention is the whole issue of order. I think within the Afro-American religious tradition, there is the assumption that the world is structured based on rationality, and there is underlying all there is in reality a kind of order, structure, and unity. That's basic to the Afro-American religious tradition, and I find process theology suggesting that in various ways. So I think that's very important. Another theme that comes out of that notion of order is hope, the element of hope, which has been abiding within Afro-American religious tradition. A hope that transcends all episodic crisis. If the individual finds him or herself caught into a crisis, one recognizes that this crisis is not ultimate, but it's episodic. And that comes out of this whole dimension of order that underlies reality, and consequently, process thought picks that up by suggesting the primordial nature of God provides inexhaustible possibilities to history. So consequently, in the self-actualization process, there is always hope. And God, of course, becomes the vanguard of that hope, because God is, in process thought, the one that is infinite in patience and care for humanity. Another element that is significant in process thought, and I think is compatible with much of Afro-American religious tradition, is suffering, the suffering God. Out of the Afro-American tradition, there is this notion of intimacy between the self and God. And that notion of intimacy has sustained Afro-American tradition until today. And if there is any contribution out of process thought that is of paramount significance, it is the notion of a God that identifies with creaturely existence at the level of intimacy, caring, and loving. So these, of course, become most important in religious experience. Another dimension that I think is very important, that is eschatology. It has been misdirected by many historians that Afro-American religious tradition focuses exclusively on otherworldly eschatology, that the hope has been trans-historical. And we found that this distorts the legacy of Afro-American tradition, that the core of it resides in the quest for liberation both in this world and the anticipation of life being much greater than anything this world can afford. So consequently, what you have out of that tradition is a notion of realized eschatology that is never exhausted within the immediate circumstance. And I think this is a point that process thought provides, that the future is open-ended. And so we are not looking toward something beyond history to transform this world as much as we are looking for something that is viable for alternatives within this world. Another point of tension I find in the traditions is Christology. I think out of the Afro-American tradition, you have a Christology that makes Jesus Christ generically different in terms of how one perceives him. Namely, that the Afro-American tradition tends to deify Christ at the one hand, and on the other hand, it tends to want to make Christ compatible with creaturely existence, etc. Process thought tends to see Christ in a different way. That Christ is not deified in traditional manner, but Christ represents the self-actualization of the possibilities that come from God's initial aim. So the Christology out of process thought is not a high Christology as much as it is a low Christology. Now, I think this is significant, but it represents a point of difference. However, I think when one looks at Howard Thurman, one finds compatible Christologies, because for him, Jesus Christ becomes the great teacher, the sage, the embodiment of God's self-actualization. And I find here, by far, significant points of convergence here. A point in process theology that I think is helpful is the nature of the church. How does process theology define the nature of the church? The church, if one were to extrapolate from process thought to envision the church, one would suggest a quest for making the heavenly vision, the beatific vision, forever impacting our creaturely existence. The church becomes the conservation of all of that, the conservation of all of those visions, those aims in history. I find the Afro-American religious tradition perceiving the church in such a manner that this becomes the vanguard of God's power in the world, and consequently the heavenly vision is partially realized within temporal existence. That completes my discussion.